The courtroom hummed with a low, restless energy, as though the walls themselves knew something extraordinary was about to unfold. Reporters tapped their pens against notepads, whispering hurried predictions. Outside, through the heavy glass doors, the roar of protesters spilled faintly into the chamber, chants, slogans, and the metallic clash of signs being waved against barricades. Inside, however, a tense silence reigned, broken only by the scrape of chairs and the occasional cough. At the plaintiff's table sat Jasmine Crockett, her posture perfectly straight, her gaze locked ahead. There was no fidgeting, no nervous glance around the room. She looked as though she had rehearsed stillness itself, drawing strength from it. Every so often, her fingers brushed against the edge of a worn notebook that lay unopened on the desk. A private anchor in the storm. Across from her, Judge Andrew Napolitano presided, robed in black, his expression calm, but carrying the sharpness of a man used to commanding every room he entered. His eyes scanned the chamber with the casual confidence of someone who had spent decades basking in authority. To the casual observer, his presence was immovable, unshakable, yet to Jasmine, every detail of his composure carried weight, every gesture a signal of the battle to come. The gallery was filled with more than spectators. It was filled with history waiting to be written. Law students craned forward, notebooks open. Politicians' aides whispered into phones, recording every subtle shift in the proceedings. The press cameras clicked like insects in the shadows, desperate to capture the flicker of doubt, the moment of weakness, the spark of confrontation. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, not at the judge himself, but at the system he embodied. For her, this wasn't merely a case. It was a reckoning with the very machinery of justice that had too often been bent into the service of power. She inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried both steel and sorrow. And in that fragile silence, before any argument had been spoken, the weight of the trial pressed upon every heart in the room. Something irreversible was about to begin. The story of this courtroom clash had not begun in silence. It had begun months earlier, with a sentence that sparked a fire. Judge Andrew Napolitano, speaking before a panel of conservative lawmakers, had delivered what seemed at first to be another academic interpretation of constitutional law. His words carried the polish of experience, the kind of rhetoric that echoed in lecture halls and cable news interviews. But buried within his sweeping defense of judicial tradition was a claim that the Constitution granted far broader authority to executive power than most had ever conceded. Order is preserved, Napolitano had said, his voice deliberate, measured, and chillingly confident. When interpretation bows to the stability of precedent, not the chaos of modern reform, liberty itself depends on restraint. For his followers, it was a reaffirmation of certainty in an uncertain age. For Jasmine Crockett, it was an assault on the very principles she had sworn to defend. That evening, in the cramped office of her congressional suite, Jasmine had watched the clip replay across every major network. The judge's words were not simply legal philosophy, they were a weapon, aimed at locking systemic inequities into permanence. She leaned back in her chair, her hands tightening around a cold mug of untouched coffee. The television flickered in the dim light, and she whispered to herself, restraint for whom? Liberty for whom? Her staff urged caution. They told her that Napolitano was untouchable, a figure revered in both judicial and media circles, someone who could not be dislodged by a rising congresswoman from Texas. But Jasmine's years as a public defender had forged a stubbornness in her bones. She had seen firsthand the wreckage left when precedent was elevated above justice, families broken by rulings that treated people like abstractions, voices silenced because the law had been interpreted as though it were stone. In late-night strategy meetings, her advisors laid out the risks. Challenging Napolitano would ignite a war that might consume her career. The media would cast her as reckless, perhaps even ambitious to the point of arrogance. Party leadership might distance themselves, wary of alienating the old guard. You'll be standing against a man with decades of legal scholarship behind him, one aide warned. He'll bury you under paper and Latin phrases before you finish your opening statement. But Jasmine only shook her head. This isn't about me. It's about what happens when those words take root. If he convinces the country that liberty is found in submission to power, we're finished. We can't afford silence. The decision was made in that moment, though she knew the road ahead would be merciless. Filing the challenge was not merely a legal step, it was an act of defiance. A call to drag philosophy out of ivory towers and into the raw light of lived reality. The case would not just test legal arguments, it would test the nation's appetite for truth. As weeks turned into months, the tension built. Editorials thundered from both sides. One columnist hailed Napolitano as the last guardian of constitutional integrity. Another accused Crockett of political theater disguised as jurisprudence. Talk shows turned the conflict into spectacle, pairing her image against his in graphics that resembled boxing posters. Yet beneath the noise, the gravity of what was unfolding began to take shape. This was not about one ruling, nor one interpretation. It was about the soul of constitutional law itself, whether it served as a shield for the vulnerable or as armor for the powerful. The day Jasmine filed the case, she walked past a sea of cameras on the courthouse steps, her head held high. Microphones were thrust toward her, voices shouting questions. Are you trying to rewrite the Constitution? Do you think you can win against a judge with Napolitano's record? She paused, her face calm, her voice even. I'm not here to rewrite the Constitution, she said. I'm here to remind us what it already promised. Her words cut through the frenzy like a blade, replayed across news cycles until they became a rallying cry. For some, she was a reckless agitator. For others, she was the voice they had been waiting for. And so, by the time both figures met in that courtroom, the seeds of conflict had already grown into something larger than law. Storm gathering on the horizon, ready to break. The courthouse steps had become a theater long before the trial ever began. By dawn, the plaza outside was already filled with satellite trucks, tangled cables, and journalists rehearsing their opening lines to cameras that blinked red with anticipation. Placards bobbed above the crowd, some painted with Jasmine Crockett's face, her name scrawled in bold strokes beside words like truth and justice. Others bore Napolitano's portrait, captioned with Defender of Order and the Last Judge Standing. What should have been a solemn legal proceeding was transformed into a national spectacle, a public duel waged not only with legal briefs, but with sound bites. On one side of the steps, cable news anchors stood framed against courthouse columns, breathlessly declaring that the trial would decide the balance of liberty and law in modern America. On the other side, talk radio hosts denounced it as a political stunt dressed in a robe. Inside her modest congressional office, Jasmine watched the frenzy unfold on a muted television. A split screen showed her face alongside Napolitano's. The chyron blared, the young congresswoman versus the legal titan. The imagery reduced years of study, sacrifice, and lived experience into the choreography of combat. Jasmine sat forward, in her chair, elbows on her knees, jaw tight. She had expected resistance. She had not expected theater. Her chief of staff, Malik, entered the room with a stack of newspapers. They're making this into a prize fight, he muttered, laying the headlines on the desk. Crockett risks it all. Napolitano holds the line. Courtroom clash could reshape the nation. Jasmine picked one up, her eyes scanning the bold print. Before tossing it aside, let them have their headlines, she said. I'm not here to play a part in their circus. But even as she spoke, she knew the truth. The court of public opinion was already deliberating. Long before the jury had been sworn in, the public wanted spectacle, and the media would not hesitate to provide it. Every word, every expression, every stumble or triumph inside the courtroom would be packaged and replayed on 100 screens. Before the day was over, the morning of the trial's opening, the air outside the courthouse was heavy with chants. Protesters leaned over barricades, shouting into megaphones. One group shouted in unison, "Crockett for the people," while another roared back, "Napolitano for the law." The chants collided in a discordant symphony that echoed off marble walls. Each side convinced the nation's fate hinged on the outcome. When Jasmine arrived, dressed in a deep navy suit that spoke of both authority and humility, cameras swarmed around her. Questions fired like bullets. "Congresswoman, are you prepared to face Judge Napolitano? Do you believe the Constitution is on your side? Are you here for justice or politics? She paused briefly, her expression calm but resolute. I'm here for the truth, she said softly, her words nearly drowned by the din. Yet the microphones caught every syllable, replaying it endlessly on news broadcasts. Napolitano, by contrast, arrived through a side entrance, flanked by clerks and loyal aides. His strategy was deliberate, to appear above the noise, untouchable by the chaos outside. The media, however, filled the vacuum with speculation. Some praised his dignity, others accused him of cowardice. Even silence became ammunition in the narrative war. That evening, the networks aired dueling panels. Legal scholars dissected Napolitano's precedents with surgical precision, while activists invoked Crockett's history as a public defender. One commentator sneered, "She's out of her depth. He's been interpreting law longer than she's been alive." Another countered, "And yet, that's exactly why she's dangerous, because she refuses to be intimidated." In living rooms across the country, families argued over dinner tables. Was this trial about a single misinterpretation, or was it the opening shot in a larger struggle for the meaning of justice itself? Jasmine, alone in her hotel room that night, muted the television and let the silence wash over her. She leaned against the window, watching the glow of reporters' lights still buzzing outside the courthouse. For a moment, she closed her eyes, gathering herself. "This isn't my show," she whispered. "This is their future." But even as she said it, she knew the media circus would never leave her untouched. She would have to fight not just within the courtroom, but in every living room, every broadcast, every headline that tried to turn principle into performance. The battle for truth was no longer confined to the law. It was now a war of stories, and in that war, every word mattered. The courtroom was standing room only when the gavel finally fell. The air snapped with a sudden hush, as though every breath had been trapped between marble walls. The jury sat, rigid in their chairs, pens poised. Reporters lined the back rows, fingers hovering over keyboards, ready to broadcast each syllable into the bloodstream of the nation. Judge Andrew Napolitano leaned forward, his robes sweeping across the bench, like shadows falling on stone. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, scanned the room. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had spent decades weaving his identity with the law. "Itself, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone slow, deliberate, each word placed like a brick in a fortress. "We are not gathered here to rewrite history, nor to indulge in passion masquerading as principle. We are here to protect the very foundation upon which this nation stands, its Constitution." His words rolled across the room like thunder. Heads nodded in the gallery. Some jurors scribbled dutifully, though others simply stared, captivated by the gravity of his presence. Napolitano continued, drawing on centuries of precedent. Case after case recited with surgical precision. He quoted from Federalist Papers, cited obscure rulings, invoking names that hung heavy with reverence in legal circles. "Precedent," he declared, his voice rising, "is not merely tradition. It is the spine of order. Without it, we collapse into chaos." The effect was almost hypnotic. Even those who opposed him felt pulled by the rhythm of his logic. He made the law sound like scripture, immovable and eternal. A murmur of agreement spread through parts of the audience, and Jasmine could see the shift, the jury leaning ever so slightly in his favor, their pens tracing his authority across the page. Napolitano's lips curled into the faintest of smiles as he turned toward her table. "My opponent," he said, with just enough pause to let the words hang in the air, "would have you believe that the Constitution is malleable, that its principles bend to the passions of the moment. But passion is not law, emotion is not order, and without order, there can be no liberty." He let the silence linger. For a moment, the courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the Congresswoman's reply. But Jasmine did not move. She sat utterly still, her hands folded, her gaze fixed straight ahead. To the jury, she looked calm, but to Napolitano, her silence was an irritation, a refusal to acknowledge his dominance. He leaned back, the confidence of a man who believed he had already landed the decisive blow. "I will show," he concluded, "that my interpretation is not an opinion, but an inheritance that protects us all." The gavel struck to signal the pause in proceedings. A ripple of noise swept through the gallery reporters. Whispering, pens scratching furiously, camera shutters clicking like rainfall. Napolitano closed his folder with a deliberate snap, his expression triumphant. Jasmine inhaled deeply. Beneath her composed exterior, her mind raced not with fear, but with precision. She had expected this. His strategy was predictable. Bury her under precedent, dazzle the room with intellectual theater, frame himself as the guardian of stability. He wanted to paint her as reckless, emotional, even dangerous, but she would not play his game. She lowered her eyes briefly to the worn notebook resting on the desk before her. On the first page, scrawled in her own handwriting, was a single line: "Law must serve the living." Not entomb them. As she read those words, a calmness washed over her. Napolitano had struck first, but his fortress of precedent had cracks. She knew where to press, where to widen them, where to let truth echo louder than tradition. The jury whispered among themselves, still caught in the weight of Napolitano's rhetoric. But Jasmine's silence, her refusal to flinch, to react, to give him the satisfaction of immediate resistance, began to settle into the room. Like an unspoken challenge, the first strike had been delivered, the counter-strike was yet to come. The tension in the courtroom was a living thing, pulsing like static electricity. The gallery sat in rapt silence, breath suspended as if the very air carried the weight of what would unfold next. Jasmine Crockett adjusted the microphone before her steady hands betraying none of the fire burning in her chest. She had waited for this moment, the moment when the judge's towering presence could no longer obscure the truth. Napolitano leaned forward, his tone calculated, his words deliberate. "Ms. Crockett, it's easy to mistake passion for clarity. You present your case with vigor, but vigor does not substitute for sound interpretation of law." The words landed like pebbles against steel. Jasmine did not flinch. She folded her hands, pausing just long enough to make the silence sting. "Passion without clarity is chaos," she said, her voice firm. "But clarity without honesty, Judge, is deception, and deception in the guise of authority. That is the greatest threat to justice." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in, catching the faint twitch at the corner of Napolitano's mouth. For the first time, the weight of his authority seemed to waver beneath the scrutiny of a younger, sharper challenger. Jasmine leaned in, her gaze unrelenting. "You claim my interpretation is clouded by passion, yet your interpretation strips the law of its spirit. You reduce living principles to rigid lines, as though justice were merely ink on parchment. But people live under this law, Judge. People bleed because of its misuse. You know this, and yet you distort it to fit your narrative." The judge's voice sharpened like steel striking stone. "Careful, Congresswoman. To accuse a judge of distortion is to tread on dangerous ground." Her reply was swift, a spark thrown into dry tinder. Dangerous ground is the only place worth standing when truth is at stake. The audience gasped. The tension broke into 1,000 sharp edges as all eyes darted between them. Napolitano shifted, straightening in his chair, his robes billowing slightly as he leaned back. His authority, once an immovable monument, now seemed fragile, a fortress under siege. Jasmine did not relent. "Let us be clear. You argue that precedent defines truth. But precedent, Judge, has been used to justify horrors. Precedent once upheld slavery. Precedent once denied women the right to vote. Precedent once silenced those who dared to challenge power. If we cling to precedent without conscience, we repeat history's darkest sins." Napolitano's hand curled into a fist upon the bench. His lips tightened, but no rebuttal formed. The room quivered with the silence of his pause, a silence louder than any outburst. Jasmine pressed forward, her words now carrying the rhythm of conviction, each syllable striking like a gavel. "Law is not merely a shield for the powerful. It is the last refuge for the vulnerable. When you dismiss the spirit of justice in favor of cold technicalities, you abandon those who depend on it most. That is your misinterpretation, Judge. And it is time someone exposed it." The gallery erupted in applause, scattered at first. Then swelling like a storm, the bailiff shouted for order. his voice cracking beneath the roar of voices rising in unity. Cameras flashed like lightning, illuminating Jasmine's figure as she stood against the bench. Resolute, unwavering, Napolitano's eyes burned with restrained fury, but in that moment, the balance of the room had shifted. No longer was he the towering arbiter of authority. He was a man forced to defend his shadowed interpretations against the blinding light of truth. Jasmine sat back, her heart pounding, though her expression betrayed none of it. For the first time, she could see the flicker of doubt in his gaze, and with it, the dawning realization that his hold on this courtroom, on this narrative, was beginning to slip. The battle was no longer about words. It was about who would claim the soul of justice before the eyes of the nation. The courtroom had become a stage where silence was louder than thunder. For several long seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. The audience leaned forward, waiting for the echo of Crockett's words to either be crushed by authority or solidified as undeniable truth. Judge Napolitano's gavel rested in his grip, motionless. His face, usually a fortress of stern confidence, betrayed a flicker of unease. His eyes darted downward at the papers before him, as though seeking an escape route written between the lines of his own arguments. Jasmine Crockett saw it, that hesitation, that moment of retreat masked behind legal jargon and judicial authority, and she seized it like a predator closing in on its prey. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying not only to the front of the bench, but to every corner of the chamber. "You've built this argument on a foundation that doesn't exist. You've taken liberties with interpretation liberties that silence those without the privilege of standing where I stand. But this chamber doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people." The crowd stirred, a low ripple spreading through the rows like wind pushing over grass. She didn't look at them. She kept her gaze locked on Napolitano. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, but his rebuttal came slow, deliberate. "Counselor Crockett, you mistake passion for precision. The law is not molded by sentiment or politics. It is written in cold ink and must be read as such. If you take away that objectivity, you reduce justice to chaos." She took a single step closer, her heels clicking against the marble, echoing louder than any gavel strike. "And yet, it is your ink, your reading, that twists the words to cage people instead of freeing them. What you call objectivity, many call oppression. What you call order, many call silence. I'm not here to reduce justice to chaos. I'm here to reveal the chaos you've been hiding beneath the pretense of order." Gasps, whispers, a stifled "she's right somewhere in the back row." Napolitano's lips tightened, his composure slipping inch by inch. His response carried a sharper edge, one meant to slice through her momentum. "This is not a rally. Ms. Crockett, it is not your stage to sway the masses. This is a court of law, governed by centuries of precedent, not the whims of popular opinion." She raised her chin, unshaken. "Then why does your argument sound more like performance than principle?" The line landed like a dagger. A few people clapped before the bailiff shot them a warning glance. The applause cut off, but the energy was unstoppable now. The balance had shifted, and everyone knew it. Napolitano leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Lower, steadier. You assume that by exposing a weakness in my phrasing, you've dismantled the integrity of law itself. You haven't. What you've done is introduce confusion into a space that demands clarity." Crockett shook her head slowly, decisively. "No. What I've done is cut through the confusion you planted. The people are not confused, Judge. They're watching, listening, understanding for the first time that the veil has been lifted. And once truth is seen, it can't be unseen." The air in the chamber turned heavy, as though history itself was pausing to take notes. For a long moment, the judge and the congresswoman held each other's gaze, locked in a silent battle of endurance, authority against defiance, tradition against revelation. Finally, Napolitano leaned back, his hand lowering the gavel to the bench with a hollow thud, not in anger, not in triumph, but in quiet resignation. He did not refute her again. The silence that followed was not one of order, but of awe. The chamber understood it had just witnessed something rare, a power dynamic flipped, a narrative rewritten, not by force, but by fearless truth. Jasmine Crockett turned her head slightly, her eyes sweeping over the room, meeting the faces of those who had doubted her, those who had hoped she would rise, and those who had feared she would. And in that silence, the audience realized what had truly been exposed was not just the misinterpretation of a judge but the possibility of change itself. The courtroom felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to witness the shift. The tension that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled into a palpable force. Every person in the gallery sensed it. Something fundamental was changing. What began as a legal confrontation had transformed into a public reckoning. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, poised but simmering with quiet energy. She watched Napolitano, who now seemed less like a commanding figure and more like a man forced onto unfamiliar terrain. His earlier authority, sharp and unyielding, had dulled in the face of scrutiny that refused to be intimidated. The judge's notes were scattered across the bench, his pen moving faster than his words could escape, a subtle signal that even he understood the walls of his fortress were cracking. She rose slowly, letting her presence fill the courtroom without a single word. Every eye tracked her movement, jurors, spectators, reporters. The cameras didn't just capture her, they amplified her. The nation would see her, standing firm, a single figure confronting decades of entrenched authority. "I will speak now," Jasmine began, her voice steady, measured, but carrying an unspoken fire, not merely to correct misinterpretation, but to confront the implications of that misinterpretation. When law is stripped of empathy and reduced to technicality, it is no longer a protector, it becomes a weapon. A hush fell. Even Napolitano leaned forward, pensively, as though weighing each word, feeling its weight against the precedent he had spent decades building. Jasmine's eyes scanned the room, meeting the jurors' gaze, connecting with the hearts of those who were witnesses to history unfolding. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice unwavering, "you have repeatedly emphasized the supremacy of precedent, and yet, precedent has justified cruelty, exclusion, and injustice. We do not respect law by clinging blindly to past interpretations. We respect it by ensuring it serves those it was meant to protect." A subtle murmur ran through the room. Reporters exchanged glances. One whispered, "She's dismantling him," without raising her voice. The power of restraint, of carefully measured conviction, was becoming her weapon. Napolitano's hand tightened on the bench. "You assume that compassion alone can dictate law," he said, the measured authority in his voice giving way to a sharper edge. "Compassion is not a foundation for justice. Order is, and without order, liberty dies." Jasmine leaned forward slightly, the intensity in her gaze cutting through the chamber like a blade. "Order without justice is tyranny," she said, firmly. "Liberty without equality is illusion. If we continue to elevate precedent above humanity, we do not preserve the Constitution, we betray it." The words reverberated in the silent courtroom, each syllable striking like a gavel, resonating deeper than any legal citation Napolitano could summon. Even the spectators, who had come expecting a sterile debate, found themselves drawn in. The murmur of approval grew, subtle at first, then swelling as the clarity of her argument crystallized. Her words were no longer just legal counterpoints, they were ethical imperatives, philosophical truths wrapped in the structure of the law. Napolitano's lips pressed into a thin line. He had anticipated challenge, but not this. He had expected technical rebuttals, perhaps even political theatrics, but he had not anticipated moral clarity delivered with the precision of lived experience. As she returned to her seat, Jasmine's expression softened slightly, though the fire in her eyes remained. The courtroom, once a theater of spectacle, had transformed into a crucible where truth was being refined, hammered against the weight of authority, until it emerged stronger, undeniable. The tide had turned. The first strike had come from Napolitano, but the counterstrike had landed with precision, and the courtroom now recognized it. For the first time, it wasn't just a legal battle, it was a confrontation between conscience and convention, a struggle that extended far beyond the marble walls into the conscience of a nation. And in that moment, everyone understood. Jasmine Crockett had shifted the narrative. The fight for justice had a new champion, and the courtroom would never be the same. By mid-morning, the courtroom had become a crucible of competing energies. Inside, every movement, every glance, every measured syllable carried weight. Outside, The world had begun to watch. Television screens across the country displayed live footage. Jasmine Crockett seated confidently at the plaintiff's table, Judge Napolitano poised yet visibly cautious, and reporters capturing every flicker of tension. The media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. News anchors dissected her every word, pausing to replay moments of her calm precision against Napolitano's earlier statements. On social media, clips circulated with captions that framed the trial as a battle of conscience versus convention. Some hailed her as a fearless champion of truth. Others painted her as an upstart challenging centuries of legal orthodoxy. Either way, no one could look away. Inside the courtroom, Jasmine's composure was a deliberate contrast to the intensity outside. She understood that her challenge extended beyond legal arguments. She was now addressing public conscience. Every inflection, every carefully chosen phrase would echo across living rooms and newsrooms alike. She could feel the weight of the nation's attention, but rather than flinch, she leaned into it. Napolitano, aware of the shifting tides, attempted to reassert control. He rose, his voice firm, commanding the room. The law is not a tool for popularity. It is not swayed by applause or outrage. We convene here to uphold principles, not entertain the masses. A subtle chuckle rippled through the gallery, quickly stifled, but not unnoticed by the cameras. Jasmine seized the moment. She stood, her presence commanding attention. And yet, Judge, principles are meaningless if they are invisible to those they are meant to protect. Law that cannot be understood, law that cannot be challenged, becomes tyranny disguised as order. People are not merely spectators, they are stakeholders, and they demand clarity, fairness, and accountability. The jury shifted in their seats. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even some of Napolitano's supporters felt the tremor in the argument, a quiet but undeniable reminder that authority alone cannot silence truth. Outside, protests intensified, voices calling for justice, for transparency, for accountability, rose higher, synchronized with the rhythm of her words inside. For the first time, the courtroom and the streets seemed to pulse together. Bound by the same moral urgency, Napolitano tried to regain control. His tone edged with exasperation. You mistake visibility for validity. A law interpreted with care is not less just because people notice it. Justice is not a performance. Jasmine's response was calm but cutting. Justice becomes performance when it is performed for the few and hidden from the many. Visibility is not the enemy of justice, it is its safeguard. Transparency ensures accountability, and accountability ensures that the law serves rather than enslaves. Her voice resonated through the room, imbued with both conviction and empathy. It was no longer merely legal reasoning, it was a call to conscience. The gallery, once silent observers, now leaned forward collectively, sensing that history was being shaped in these moments. Even Napolitano's aides whispered among themselves, the certainty that had once anchored their leader beginning to erode. His interpretations, though meticulously cited, now faced the piercing light of public scrutiny. The fortress he had constructed with precedent and authority was no longer unassailable. By the time recess was called, the courtroom hummed with a new energy, a mixture of awe, tension, and anticipation. Jasmine returned to her seat, her face calm, but inside she felt the exhilaration of momentum. She had not only challenged a powerful judge, she had mobilized the court of public opinion, demonstrating that truth could resonate beyond the walls of law. Napolitano, seated again at the bench, studied her carefully. The first cracks had appeared in his armor, and he knew the days ahead would demand strategy, adaptation, and perhaps even humility. The balance of power was shifting, and the next strike, legal, personal, and philosophical, would determine whether the courtroom became a stage of justice or spectacle. The eyes of the nation were watching. The stakes had never been higher. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the courtroom, casting long shadows across polished wood and marble. The air was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew that today it would be different. Today, the trial was no longer just about law. It had become about conviction, identity, and the courage to stand for truth in the face of authority. Jasmine Crockett rose, her posture perfect, her gaze unwavering. The gallery leaned forward, Sensing that her words would strike deeper than precedent or procedure, she had come prepared not only with legal evidence, but with the weight of experience, the clarity of principle, and the unflinching moral authority of someone who had walked the streets and witnessed injustice firsthand. Judge Napolitano adjusted his robes, his expression a mixture of irritation and calculation. "Congresswoman," he began, his voice measured yet steely, "you continue to conflate moral philosophy with legal interpretation. The law does not bend to personal conviction, it bends to reason, precedent, and centuries of careful deliberation." Jasmine did not hesitate. "Judge, reason without humanity is hollow. Precedent without scrutiny is dangerous. I am not here to question your knowledge of the law. I am here to expose its consequences when wielded as a shield for the powerful and a cage for the vulnerable." Her words rippled through the courtroom. Reporters leaned closer, scribbling in frenzied cursive, while the jurors shifted, suddenly aware that the argument before them was no longer academic, it was visceral. Napolitano's eyes narrowed. "You speak as though justice is something that can be redefined on a whim. Law is enduring because it resists whims. Chaos is born from sentiment masquerading as principle." Jasmine stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like steel. "And yet, Judge, it is precisely this rigidity that perpetuates chaos for those whose lives depend on interpretation. When law refuses to adapt, it punishes, silences, and isolates. Order without compassion is tyranny. Liberty without fairness is illusion. And if you cannot see that, then the people will." A hushed murmur passed through the courtroom. Some jurors exchanged glances, unsure whether to marvel or fear the audacity of her statement. The weight of history pressed down on Napolitano, whose carefully cultivated image of untouchable authority now felt fragile under the spotlight of her scrutiny. He leaned forward, lowering his voice but sharpening the edge in his tone. "You risk turning this court into a stage for spectacle. Do you understand the gravity of accusing a judge of injustice?" "I understand it," she replied evenly. "I understand that the law is not an abstract fortress. I understand that every misinterpretation has consequences that ripple across families, communities, and generations. I understand that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and I refuse to be complicit." Her words landed like thunder, echoing off the walls. For the first time, Napolitano paused not to consult precedent, not to adjust his argument, but to measure the impact of a challenge that was as much emotional as it was legal. He realized that his authority, grounded in centuries of tradition, could not alone withstand the force of conscience paired with evidence. The courtroom seemed to lean in collectively, holding its breath as if recognizing the stakes. The conflict had moved beyond law into moral territory. It was now about who would define justice in this moment, and who would bear the responsibility of its interpretation. When she returned to her seat, Jasmine's calm belied the storm of emotion she had stirred. She had drawn lines in the sand, forcing the judge, the jury, and the nation to confront uncomfortable truths. Napolitano sat silently, the first flickers of doubt crossing his composed visage. For the first time, the judge seemed human, fallible, and challenged not merely by argument, but by the undeniable presence of justice itself. The room waited, tense, aware that the next exchanges would not only decide the courtroom, but would shape the narrative of a nation. The line had been drawn, and neither side would retreat. The courtroom was quiet, yet the silence vibrated with expectation. Every heartbeat seemed amplified, echoing against the high ceilings and polished wood. The trial had entered a new phase one, where law and morality collided, and every word would reverberate far beyond the bench. Jasmine Crockett stood again, her stance calm but resolute. She had studied every precedent, anticipated every maneuver, and yet she knew that today's argument would not rely solely on citations or technicalities. Today demanded philosophy, humanity, and the courage to speak truth in the face of authority. Judge Napolitano adjusted his glasses, his voice steady but tinged with impatience. "Congresswoman, it appears your arguments have transcended law itself. You speak in abstractions, as if legal interpretation could be replaced by moral theory. Yet this court must operate within the boundaries of reasoned jurisprudence, not ethical conjecture. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, considering the words. Then, with deliberate calm, she responded, "Judge, jurisprudence without conscience is hollow. Reason without reflection is a blade without purpose. The law is meant to serve people, not shelter itself behind the illusion of impartiality. If we ignore the human consequences of interpretation, we abandon justice entirely." The jurors shifted, uneasily, caught between the weight of precedent and the clarity of her argument. Outside, in the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously, sensing that this exchange was no longer a legal debate. It was a lesson in ethics broadcasted to the world. Napolitano leaned forward, voice firm, trying to reclaim dominance. "You presume that human consequences outweigh legal certainty, that compassion can supersede the law. Yet laws are designed to withstand the tempests of sentiment. Without such stability, liberty collapses into chaos." Jasmine stepped closer, her presence commanding attention. "Stability without justice is tyranny. Liberty without fairness is nothing but illusion. Laws exist for people, not the other way around. You speak of chaos as if it is to be feared, but what is truly fearful is the silence of those oppressed by rigid interpretation. You mistake compliance for order and deference for truth." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The weight of her words was palpable, piercing through centuries of entrenched tradition. The media cameras captured every syllable, framing her as both challenger and moral compass.